Imagine a 4-year-old child, barely old enough to tie her own shoes, suddenly finding herself completely alone in the dense Colombian rainforest with no food, no shelter, and no hope of rescue. This is exactly what happened to Marina Chapman in the 1950s, during one of the most violent periods in Colombian history. What followed was a survival story so extraordinary, so impossible to believe, that it challenges everything we think we know about human adaptability and the bond between humans and animals. For 5 years, this little girl lived not as a human child, but as a member of a troop of capuchin monkeys, learning their language, eating their food, and following their laws of survival. Her story has been dismissed by skeptics, celebrated by believers, and studied by scientists around the world. What you're about to hear will make you question the very boundaries between civilization and the wild, between human nature and animal instinct. Marina Chapman was born around 1950 in a small rural village in Colombia, during a period that historians call La Violencia, a brutal civil conflict that would claim over 200,000 lives and tear the country apart for nearly 2 decades. The Colombia of Marina's early childhood was a land of terror, where political violence, kidnappings, and massacres were part of daily life, especially in remote rural areas where government protection was virtually non-existent. Marina's earliest memories are fragmented, as is often the case with trauma survivors and very young children. She remembers living with her family in a simple house surrounded by lush green mountains and coffee plantations. Her father worked the land, as did most men in their region, trying to make a living from the rich Colombian soil while navigating the dangerous political landscape that could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. The family was not wealthy by any means, but they had what they needed: a roof over their heads, food on the table, and the security of being together. Marina's mother took care of the household and children, teaching Marina the basic skills that all young girls in rural Colombia learned: how to help with cooking, cleaning, and the countless small tasks that kept a family functioning in an agricultural community. But the tranquility of their rural life was constantly threatened by the violence that swept through Colombia like a plague during those years. Political factions fought ruthlessly for control of territory, and civilians often found themselves caught in the crossfire. Kidnapping had become a common tactic used by various armed groups to raise money, instill fear, or settle political scores. Families with even modest means lived in constant fear that their children might be taken. Marina was about 4 years old when her world collapsed forever. The details of that fateful day remain somewhat unclear in her memory, which is not surprising given her young age and the traumatic nature of what happened. What she does remember is playing near her family's home when 2 strange men appeared. They were not from the village. She had never seen them before, and something about their presence immediately filled her with fear. The men approached her with false kindness, speaking in gentle tones that didn't match the threatening energy she sensed from them. Before she could run or call for help, they grabbed her, covering her mouth to prevent her from screaming. The last thing she remembered of her childhood home was the sound of her own muffled cries, as these strangers carried her away from everything she had ever known. The kidnapping was swift and brutal. Marina was thrown into some kind of vehicle and driven away from her village, away from her family, away from her life. She would never see her parents again, never know if they searched for her, never learn whether they survived the violence that was consuming their country. In a matter of minutes, she had been transformed from a beloved daughter into a commodity, a possession to be disposed of as her captors saw fit. The journey that followed is largely lost to memory and trauma, but Marina recalls fragments: the terror of being in the hands of strangers, the confusion of not understanding what was happening to her, and the desperate hope that her parents would somehow rescue her. She was just a small child who wanted nothing more than to go home to her mother's arms and her father's protection. But home was now impossible to reach, and Marina Chapman was about to begin a journey into a world that no human child should ever have to navigate alone. The journey with Marina's kidnappers lasted what felt like an eternity to a terrified 4-year-old, but was probably only a day or 2. They traveled deeper and deeper into the Colombian wilderness, far from any roads, villages, or signs of human civilization. The men seemed to know exactly where they were going, following paths that were invisible to Marina, but clearly familiar to them. Marina later speculated that her kidnappers had originally planned to hold her for ransom, expecting her family to pay for her return. But something went wrong with their plan. Perhaps her family was poorer than they had thought, or maybe the ongoing violence in the region made it impossible for them to collect payment. Whatever the reason, at some point during that terrifying journey, the men made a decision that would change Marina's life forever. They decided to abandon her. The moment when they left her alone in the jungle remains seared into Marina's memory with crystal clarity. They had stopped in a small clearing surrounded by dense rainforest that stretched endlessly in all directions. The sounds of the jungle were overwhelming. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling with the movement of unseen creatures. To a small child who had never been far from her village, it was like being dropped onto an alien planet. The men simply walked away. No explanation, no instructions, no final words. They disappeared back into the forest, leaving 4-year-old Marina completely alone in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. She called after them, begging them to come back, promising to be good if they would just take her home. But her cries were swallowed by the vast indifference of the jungle. The first few hours were pure terror. Marina had never been alone before, had never spent even a night away from her family. Now she was surrounded by sounds she didn't recognize, in a place where every shadow could hide danger. She tried to follow the path the men had taken, but within minutes she was completely lost, with no idea which direction led back to civilization and which led deeper into the wilderness. Night fell with the sudden darkness that characterizes tropical forests. The jungle that had seemed threatening during the day became absolutely terrifying in the darkness. New sounds emerged. The calls of nocturnal animals, the rustling of creatures moving through the undergrowth, and sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Marina huddled against a tree, crying for her mother, shivering with cold and fear. She had no food, no water, no shelter, and no understanding of how to survive in this environment. Most adults would have died within days in such circumstances, but Marina had one advantage that would prove crucial. She was a child, with a child's incredible capacity for adaptation and learning. Her brain was still developing, still forming the neural pathways that would determine how she understood and interacted with the world. The first few days were a nightmare of hunger, thirst, and constant terror. Marina tried eating leaves and berries, many of which made her violently sick. She found some muddy water to drink, which helped with her thirst but gave her severe stomach problems. She had no idea which plants were safe and which were poisonous, which animals were dangerous and which were harmless. But gradually, through trial and error and the desperate instinct for survival, she began to learn the basic rules of jungle existence. She discovered which fruits were edible by watching what the birds ate. She found sources of cleaner water by following animal trails. She learned to recognize the sounds that meant danger and the sounds that meant safety. Most importantly, she began to encounter the creatures that would become her salvation, a troop of capuchin monkeys that lived in the area where she had been abandoned. At first, the monkeys were as wary of her as she was of them. But unlike the humans who had betrayed and abandoned her, these animals showed curiosity rather than cruelty toward the strange, hairless creature that had appeared in their territory. The first encounter between Marina and the capuchin monkeys was a moment that would define the rest of her childhood. She had been in the jungle for several days, growing weaker from hunger and dehydration, when she heard a chattering sound above her head. Looking up, she saw several small, intelligent faces peering down at her through the canopy. Capuchin monkeys, known for their remarkable intelligence and complex social structures. Capuchin monkeys are among the most intelligent primates in the New World, with sophisticated communication systems, tool use, and social hierarchies that rival those of many human societies. The troop that Marina encountered was probably composed of 15 to 20 individuals, led by a dominant male who would have been responsible for making decisions about territory, food sources, and potential threats. Initially, the monkeys were cautious about this strange new creature in their domain. Marina was clearly not a threat. She was small, weak, and obviously struggling to survive. But she was also unlike anything they had encountered before. Her lack of fur, her upright posture, and her unfamiliar scent marked her as an outsider who didn't belong in their world. What happened next defies easy explanation and has been the source of much scientific debate. Rather than driving Marina away or ignoring her, the monkeys began to show interest in her welfare. Some primatologists have suggested that Marina's small size and obvious vulnerability may have triggered maternal or protective instincts in some of the female monkeys. Others believe that the monkeys' natural curiosity and intelligence led them to treat her as an interesting puzzle to be solved, rather than a threat to be eliminated. Marina's first lesson from the monkeys came when she was desperately thirsty and had been drinking from muddy puddles that made her sick. She watched as the monkeys collected water from leaves and tree hollows, sources that provided cleaner liquid than the stagnant pools she had been using. When she tried to imitate their behavior, some of the monkeys actually seemed to guide her, showing her which water sources were safe and which should be avoided. Food was an even more critical lesson. Marina had been trying to eat whatever plants she could find, with often disastrous results. The monkey's diet consisted primarily of fruits, insects, small animals, and certain types of vegetation that provided necessary nutrients. By watching the monkeys and imitating their foraging behavior, Marina began to learn which foods were safe and nutritious. The learning process was not easy or immediate. Marina suffered from malnutrition, digestive problems, and the constant stress of trying to adapt to an environment for which humans are not naturally equipped. But children's brains are remarkably plastic, capable of forming new neural pathways and adapting to circumstances that would overwhelm most adults. Gradually, Marina began to understand the monkey's basic communication system. Capuchin monkeys have a complex repertoire of vocalizations, facial expressions, and body language that convey information about food sources, danger, social relationships, and emotional states. Marina started to recognize different calls, warnings about predators, announcements of food discoveries, and social interactions between troop members. More remarkably, she began to produce some of these sounds herself. Her vocal cords and mouth structure were different from those of the monkeys, so she couldn't perfectly replicate their calls, but she developed approximations that the monkeys seemed to understand and accept. This primitive communication allowed her to begin integrating into the troop's social structure. The monkeys also taught Marina essential survival skills that no human child should ever have to learn. She learned to sleep in trees, choosing branches that were high enough to be safe from ground-based predators but stable enough to support her weight. She learned to move through the forest canopy with increasing skill, though she would never match the natural agility of her adoptive family. Perhaps most importantly, she learned the monkey's system of social cooperation and mutual protection. Capuchin monkeys have complex social hierarchies and support networks that help ensure the survival of the group. Marina became, in effect, a member of this extended family, protected by the group's vigilance and contributing what she could to their collective survival. What are your thoughts on this incredible adaptation so far? Can you imagine a human child learning to communicate with monkeys and becoming part of their family? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because Marina's story is about to get even more extraordinary. As months turned into years, Marina Chapman underwent a transformation that was both remarkable and heartbreaking. The frightened 4-year-old who had been abandoned in the jungle gradually became something that existed between human and animal. A wild child who had learned to survive by abandoning much of what made her human and adopting the behaviors instincts of her monkey family. Marina's physical development during these years was profoundly affected by her unusual circumstances. Living in trees, foraging for food, and constantly moving through the forest gave her a lean, muscular build that was perfectly adapted to her environment, but very different from what her body would have become in human society. Her hands and feet became incredibly strong and dexterous from gripping branches and climbing. Her reflexes sharpened to match those of her monkey companions. Her diet consisted entirely of what the forest provided: fruits, nuts, insects, small animals, and vegetation that the monkeys deemed safe to eat. She learned to crack nuts with stones, to strip bark from certain trees to access nutritious inner layers, and to catch insects with her bare hands. Most disturbing to imagine, she ate raw meat when the monkeys caught small animals, consuming protein in whatever form was available. Marina's eating habits became completely feral during this period. She would stuff food into her mouth with both hands, eating as quickly as possible, a behavior that was adaptive in the jungle, where food sources could disappear quickly, but which would later mark her as distinctly non-human when she returned to civilization. She also developed the monkey habit of storing food in her cheeks for later consumption. Sleep patterns also changed dramatically. Instead of the long, continuous sleep periods typical of human children, Marina adopted the monkey pattern of short naps interspersed with periods of vigilance. She learned to sleep while remaining partially alert to potential dangers, a skill that was essential for survival in an environment where predators hunted at night. Perhaps most significantly, Marina's language development was completely arrested during these crucial early years. At 4 years old, she would have been rapidly expanding her vocabulary and mastering the complex grammar of her native Spanish. Instead, her verbal communication became limited to the grunts, clicks, and calls that she used to communicate with the monkeys. She lost the ability to form human words and began to think in ways that were fundamentally different from human thought patterns. The monkeys taught Marina their complex system of social interaction, which was based on physical dominance, resource sharing, and mutual grooming. She learned to show submission to higher-ranking monkeys and to assert her own position within the troop hierarchy. She participated in the social grooming that strengthened bonds between troop members, picking through the monkey's fur to remove parasites and debris. Marina also learned the monkeys' sophisticated understanding of their environment. She could predict weather changes by observing animal behavior, find water sources during dry periods, and identify the subtle signs that indicated the presence of predators. This knowledge was crucial for survival, but represented a completely different way of understanding and interacting with the world. The emotional and psychological effects of this prolonged isolation from human contact were profound. Marina lost much of her capacity for human emotional expression and social bonding. She became highly alert to physical threats, but had no framework for understanding human social cues, emotions, or relationships. The trauma of her abandonment, combined with years of living as an animal, created psychological patterns that would affect her for the rest of her life. During her time with the monkeys, Marina experienced several dangerous encounters that tested her survival skills. She learned to recognize the warning calls that indicated the presence of jaguars, the apex predators of the Colombian jungle. She survived attacks by venomous snakes by learning to identify their sounds and movements. She endured tropical diseases, parasitic infections, and injuries that would have required medical treatment in human society, but which she had to overcome using only her body's natural healing abilities. Thank you so much for staying with us through Marina's incredible transformation from human child to wild creature. I know these details are difficult to imagine, but they show the remarkable adaptability of the human spirit. The most amazing part of her story, her return to human society, is still coming. So please don't leave us now. By the time Marina was around 9 years old, she had spent more years living with monkeys than she had spent with humans. Her memory of human language, customs, and social behavior had almost completely faded. She thought like a monkey, acted like a monkey, and in many ways had become more monkey than human. She had achieved something that no human child should ever have to achieve. She had survived the impossible by sacrificing her humanity. But Marina's time in the jungle was about to come to an end in a way that would be almost as traumatic as her original abandonment. Marina's rescue from the jungle came not through an organized search mission or family members who had never stopped looking for her, but through pure chance, the kind of random encounter that seems impossible but occasionally changes lives forever. After approximately 5 years of living with the capuchin monkeys, Marina was discovered by a group of hunters who had ventured deep into the Colombian rainforest in search of game. The hunters initially thought they were seeing some kind of unknown animal moving through the trees with a troop of monkeys. When they realized it was actually a human child, their shock was so complete that they later said they questioned their own sanity. Here is a girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, moving through the forest canopy with the agility of a wild animal, communicating with monkeys through grunts and gestures, and showing no signs of recognizing them as fellow human beings. Marina's initial reaction to seeing other humans was not joy or relief, but terror. She had learned to fear anything unfamiliar, and these strange, upright creatures represented a potential threat to her and her monkey family. She tried to flee, moving through the trees with the speed and skill she had developed over years of jungle life. But the hunters were persistent, perhaps understanding that leaving a feral child in the wilderness was not an option. The capture was traumatic for Marina in ways that are difficult to imagine. For 5 years, she had lived in complete freedom, making her own decisions about where to go and what to do based on the rhythms of the forest and the needs of her monkey family. Suddenly, she found herself constrained by human hands, forced to walk on the ground instead of traveling through the trees, and separated from the only family she could remember. The monkeys' response to Marina's capture was also heartbreaking to witness. According to the hunters' accounts, the troop followed them for miles, calling out to Marina with obvious distress. The bonds she had formed with these animals were real and deep, representing the only consistent relationships she had known during her formative years. Being torn away from them was another profound trauma layered on top of all the others she had experienced. The process of reintroducing Marina to human society was complicated by the fact that she had essentially become a feral child. She could not speak, had no understanding of human customs or social behaviors, and reacted to human contact with fear and aggression. She refused to wear clothes, would not eat cooked food, and tried repeatedly to escape back to the forest. Marina's first experiences with human food were particularly challenging. After years of eating raw fruits, insects, and occasional raw meat, her digestive system had adapted to a completely different diet. Cooked foods made her sick, and she showed strong preferences for eating with her hands while crouched on the ground, behaviors that marked her as distinctly non-human to those trying to help her. Language recovery was another enormous challenge. Marina had lost not only her ability to speak Spanish, but her understanding of human communication in general. She communicated through the grunts, clicks, and physical gestures she had learned from the monkeys. Teaching her to speak again required patient work by people who understood that she was essentially learning human communication for the first time. Unfortunately, Marina's re-entry into human society was not handled with the care and expertise that such a unique case required. She was passed between various institutions and families, none of whom were equipped to deal with the complex psychological and social needs of a feral child. This period of her life was marked by confusion, fear, and continued trauma as she struggled to understand a world that seemed as alien to her as the jungle had once seemed. At some point during her adolescence, Marina found herself living on the streets of a Colombian city, trying to survive in an urban environment that was in many ways more dangerous than the jungle had been. Street life in 1960s Colombia was brutal, especially for a young girl with no family connections, no education, and behaviors that marked her as different from other people. Marina's story took another dramatic turn when she was discovered by a British family who recognized that she needed specialized care and attention. They arranged for her to come to England, where she would spend years learning to navigate human society and recovering, as much as possible, from the profound trauma of her early experiences. The transition to life in England required Marina to learn not just language and social customs, but basic concepts about human relationships, emotions, and society that most people absorb naturally during childhood. She had to learn what it meant to live in a house, to wear clothes consistently, to eat with utensils, and to interact with other people in ways that were considered normal. Marina eventually married and had children of her own, achievements that represented incredible progress given the severity of her early trauma. She learned to speak English fluently and was able to share her story with researchers, journalists, and others who were fascinated by her unique experiences. However, the effects of her feral childhood remained with her throughout her life, influencing her behavior, relationships, and understanding of the world in ways that were both subtle and profound. Her story has been documented in books, television programs, and academic studies, though it has also faced skepticism from some researchers who question whether such extreme survival and adaptation are possible. The debate about Marina's story reflects broader questions about human nature, the critical periods of childhood development, and the remarkable adaptability of the human spirit when faced with impossible circumstances. Marina Chapman's story forces us to confront fundamental questions about what makes us human and how much of our humanity depends on being raised within human society. Her survival in the Colombian jungle represents one of the most extreme examples of human adaptability ever documented. But it also illustrates the profound cost of isolation from human contact during the critical years of childhood development. The scientific community remains divided about some aspects of Marina's story. While there is no doubt that feral children exist, and that humans can survive in extreme circumstances, the specific details of her experience, particularly the extent of her integration with the monkey troop, challenge our understanding of interspecies relationships and child development. Some researchers argue that certain elements of her account may be influenced by recovered memory phenomena or the natural human tendency to fill in gaps in childhood recollections. However, the core elements of Marina's story, her kidnapping, abandonment, survival in the jungle, and eventual return to human society, are supported by documentation and witness accounts. More importantly, her story represents the experiences of countless children who have been victims of violence, abandonment, and trauma, even if their specific circumstances were different from hers. Marina's journey from feral child to functioning adult also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite experiencing trauma that would destroy many people, she was able to learn language, form relationships, and build a life for herself in human society. Her recovery was neither complete nor easy, but it represents a triumph of human determination over circumstances that should have been insurmountable. Perhaps most importantly, Marina's story serves as a reminder of the thousands of children who disappear every year in conflicts around the world. During La Violencia in Colombia, and in countless other conflicts before and since, children have been kidnapped, abandoned, and forced to survive in circumstances that no child should ever face. Marina was fortunate enough to be found and eventually rescued, but many others are not so lucky. What do you think about Marina Chapman's incredible story? Do you believe it's possible for a human child to survive 5 years in the jungle by learning to live with monkeys? What does her story tell us about human nature and our capacity for adaptation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This case has fascinated scientists, anthropologists, and survival experts for decades, and we want to hear your perspective on one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever told. If you found Marina's story as amazing and heartbreaking as we did, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most incredible true stories of human survival and adaptation, examining the moments when ordinary people overcome impossible circumstances. Make sure you watch our next recommended video about Oksana Malaya, another feral child who survived by living with wild dogs in Ukraine. It's another story that will challenge your understanding of human development and the bonds between humans and animals. Thank you for joining us for this remarkable journey into one of the most extraordinary childhood survival stories ever documented. Marina Chapman's experience reminds us that the human capacity for adaptation is almost limitless, but also that some experiences leave scars that never fully heal. Her story is ultimately one of survival, resilience, and the long journey back to humanity after experiencing the unthinkable.